Welcome to the Pharmacy Leaders Podcast with your host, Tony Guerra. The Pharmacy Leaders Podcast is a member of the Pharmacy Podcast Network, with interviews and advice on building your professional network, brand, and a purposeful second income from students, residents, and innovative professionals.
Hey, welcome to the Pharmacy Leaders Podcast. Today I have Tim Ulbrich, who was on the show previously. He's the founder of the YFP community, the Your Financial Pharmacist community. And what we wanted to do is have a little bit of fun. I don't know if you've ever played this game, but there's a Would You Rather, which gives you kind of two choices that you don't necessarily want, but it's kind of fun if you've got a long trip or something like that. So we're going to play Pharmacy Would You Rather with Tim Ulbrich. So welcome to the Pharmacy Leaders Podcast.
Thanks, Tony. Excited to be back on the show.
Hey, tell us a little bit about what's going on with the YFP community. I followed the housing month that you just had last time, and then you recently moved not only houses but jobs. So give us an update. How are you doing?
Yeah, it's been a fun and crazy month. And, this is one of those months where I got to live firsthand what I'm, educating and preaching when it comes to personal finance. So we did a September whole month-long series on the Your Financial Pharmacist podcast on home buying and things that pharmacists should be looking out for. How do you plan for home buying, best practices? And I got to share 10 lessons that I learned through the process. And it was a stressful, crazy, fun, emotional, the real estate world well. That's how it rolls. And it was a lot of fun to be able to weave that experience in live with the month of education around that topic. So my wife and I and my three boys, we just made the move from Northeast Ohio up in the Akron, Cleveland area down south, just a couple hours, about 2.5 hours near Columbus, and getting ready to start a new job at Ohio State. So go Buckeyes, and excited for what we have going on in YFP right now. We coming off that month on home buying. Actually, just this week, we're getting ready to release another episode on our Side Hustle series. Tim Church's featuring a podcast episode on that. And we got lots of great content coming up around taxes and all types of things, estate planning, investing. So if you haven't yet checked out the YFP podcast, we'd love to have you out there as a listener.
Okay, awesome. Well, let's kind of dive right in, and I'm going to make these questions maybe more about what you're going to do when you graduate, or maybe what you're doing during pharmacy school. So we'll just start with one and we'll kind of see how it goes. So let's give you the dichotomy or the two choices. You can go to a school that is a residency that is in-state, maybe just a mile or two, or even bike riding distance from where you live. I know Brandon Dyson actually did this with Georgetown. Mm-hmm. Or you are going to the most prestigious school, or residency. You have a good feeling that you would get chosen for that residency. But the cost of living is one of the top in the country. So New York, or, well, not New York Beach, but we'll say like, San Francisco, LA, maybe Florida, Miami, something like that. So which would you choose? Would you rather go with the big city, big prestige, or would you rather go to something that's maybe closer to where you are already living right now?
Yeah, this is a great one. And I think you asked it in the context of residency. And, this is one I thought about personally when I was looking at residency, but also looking at pharmacy school. And as you may guess, as the guy from Ohio that tends to be cheap and favors lower cost of living areas.
Frugal.
That's
not
right.
Cheap.
Frugal. I'm sorry. Yeah, I'm going to take the option that I'm going to save some cash. And here's why. Because I think when it comes down to whether it's prestige of program, whether it's experience and higher cost of living area, but specifically around prestige of program, well, I do think that's a variable and a factor in pharmacy. I think at the end of the day, the experience you get and the network and the relationships that you build are going to take precedence over that prestige. So even if you can save some cash, go to a program that maybe is not your top choice or in a lower cost of living area, really work hard to build those relationships, get your professional networking skills on. I think you're going to be able to make up for that and obviously be able to make some headway on student loans, which I'm passionate about, getting that debt paid off.
Yeah, I went the other direction. I actually bought my car 3 months before I graduated. I used a credit card to put the down payment down so I could come off the plane, get into my new car, get into my new job, and I moved.
Why not, right?
Yeah. I was going to move to California, but back then they had the California boards, which are still really hard, and then there's the California, the CPJE or something like that, the law exam. So I did that, and I spent extra money, but again, it's not apples to oranges. I've talked about this before, but my entire tuition bill for all 4 years was $16,000. So
A little
maybe,
different than today, right?
yeah, a little more spending money. But I did back off from California. I was going to go to California. Kind of looked at the prices out there relative to the amount of money I would make, and I moved to Arizona, which was a little bit more economical. So, but I went with I'm going to go for the experience. I've been in school for it took me 7 years. I'm going to go for the experience, and I'll take the hit with money. But
So Tony, on this one, what's interesting is I think this factor of cost of living is one that I think we underestimate a little bit. I was recently out at University of Southern California doing some work with their students, and I was talking about cost of living here in the Midwest, and they about laughed me off the stage, as you might imagine. But that's real, and obviously I love Ohio. Grew up grew up in Western New York, but I've been in the Midwest for about 15 years. And when you look at housing differences as a student transitioning, a new practitioner, that cost of living factor is such a huge component. And so I know some listening, that's out of the question of moving or doing different things or picking up from a higher cost of living area, going to a cheaper area. But if that is an option that's on the table, whether that's residency or job, especially as you're trying to get a solid financial footing and make some headway on loans, I think that's a factor that many should consider as they're making that transition. So I don't know if that's something you see with the students that you work with closely. I mean, are many often fixed in a certain area because of family, or are you seeing more flexibility of moving because of the job market and what's going on?
I'm actually seeing, because I'm on the pre-pharmacy side, and I know not a ton of our listeners are pre-pharmacy, but I'm seeing that we're seeing that applications are way down to pharmacy schools, but
Yeah.
people keep confusing that applicants are way down, and applicants are not necessarily that far down. It's just they're saying these are the 2 schools I'm going to go to, or 3 schools I'm going to go to, and that's it. So I'm seeing that because of the number of schools, the options are there, and around here they could go to Iowa or Drake, pick a private or a public, or maybe do online at Creighton, which is just another 2 hours if they even want to go there. So I think that right now what I'm seeing is that it's the schools are catering to religion in some demographics, maybe race, maybe gender, those types of things that these students really care about. And because they're going to have people that care about the same thing they do, they're just making choices and saying, hey, you know what, these are the things that I want. And but I don't think they're really looking at the money as much. It's monopoly money. How do you explain to an 18-year-old what $200,000 is? I tried to think about it in maybe poker chips. Like, how many $25 poker chips would that be? And it would like cover the table. But I can't. I still don't have a good answer to the monopoly money. But let's talk about that. Let's talk about private and public. So some of the people listening to us are in a private school. Some are in a public school. How do you maximize where you are? So pick a private or public, and which one would you prefer to try to maximize your experience at? Would you rather go with a SLAC, like a small liberal arts private, or the larger research R1 university?
Yeah, this one's hard for me because I went to a great but expensive private school. I went to Ohio Northern University, 06 program right out of high school, finished my PharmD at the age of 24. But I've taught since then at 2 public universities that are great institutions, and I've seen the great things that those graduates have gone on to do. But here's where I struggle, because as somebody coming directly out of high school, I felt like I really benefited from that smaller culture and having experiences on campus with organizations and leadership and other things that I'm not sure at that age I would have necessarily gotten or felt confident in a larger university. However, with that be said, to take a stance here at the risk of half the people hating me on the other side, I got to choose the public school specifically here, and really looking at the value of the return on investment of the pharmacy degree. And what we've seen, and people have heard me preach on our podcast, the numbers don't lie in terms of the student indebtedness upon graduation between public and private. It's about $50,000 difference on average. And we know that when we look at income for pharmacists across the country, you're not going to see huge variations based on where you went to school, especially in the market that we're in right now. And so at the end of the day, when it comes down to return on investment of the pharmacy degree, looking at the context of the job market, I've got to choose that 4-year public school and obviously making the path as quick as you possibly can.
Okay, well then I'll take the private. Even though I went to a public, I went to Maryland. I was lucky in that it was a 5,000 person campus, so the medical campus is separated. So you mentioned that you went to Southern Cal, and people will find out quickly that, wait a minute, where's the medical school? No,
Yeah.
no, that's not here. That's somewhere different. My wife went to Drake, and if I were given the choice over again, I would have gone to a private, a smaller school. But given that I graduated I went to pharmacy school 24 years ago. We only had 75 colleges of pharmacy, and 3/4 of them were public. So the choices for privates were just not there. And honestly, I don't think you could have gotten in the Drake 06 program if you hadn't already gotten in from high school. I don't think they even took transfers. But in terms of what I would prefer, if I'm going to grad school, I would want a smaller environment. I would want that kind of. I would want an. I'm not saying that public professors don't give attention to the students. I'm just saying that the primary role of a professor at a private liberal arts college is to take care of the student. The primary role of a professor at a public university is generally to bring in money for research, to do research, and include those students. But I would have chosen the private, and with that private, I would have had the network that I think would have also kind of benefited me later.
Yeah, and Tony, as you know, obviously, not all public schools are created equal, like not all private schools are created equal. And so, as your listeners know, currently attending, or maybe some of those that are listening that are looking to attend pharmacy school, you'll certainly run into public institutions that are massive research institutions where, to your point, the faculty members may have a primary obligation to research. But I just came and finished up a job at a great institution, public institution, Neomed, that we had smaller class sizes, 75 to 80 students, and we had a great balance of practice, teaching, and research. And so I think for those that are looking at going to pharmacy school, obviously looking at those factors that are most important, but also then putting it in context of the financial equation. Where do you see, Tony, the 3-year accelerated private track going, and what's your take on where those schools may be in the future as we look at a tightening job market? Applications are trending, as you mentioned before. Do you see those growing, shrinking? What do you see happening with those?
If you're Since UCSF went from a 4 to a 3, and UCSF has always been regarded as one of the top 5 in the country, I have to say
number 1 or 2 usually.
I have to say that it's going to go towards the 3, because what I think they're saying is that a pharmacy experience should be 3 years of that PharmD, and then 1 year of something. But I argue that 1 year of something could have been the MBA that you got, or it could have been the MPH that you got at the same time. So I think that's where, again, the private schools really do a much better job, is that you can come out of a private school with a PharmD, an MBA, and more important than the 2 degrees, the 2 networks. And you find that you have a completely different network getting out of the pharmacy building with those MBAs. So if I could have done it all over again, I probably would have gone to Drake PharmD MBA. That's what I would have in terms of that. So
Gotcha.
But what about let's look at cost of living in terms of a place to live. So suburban college with a low cost of living, or an urban college that has a high cost of living. How do you kind of manage the cost of living when you've kind of made your choice already? So I guess what I'm trying to say is, so you're a P2, you've drank the Kool-Aid, you've gone to maybe the APHA meetings, met with the YFP team. You're like, okay, I'm going to get this under control, P3, P4 year. How do you maximize that when you've kind of already chosen your college?
Yeah, this is a great one, and I'm speaking here out of mistake that I often am trying to help students to say, hey, you got to live like a student, and even beyond graduation, you got to live like a student for a while to be able to tackle your financial plan and goals. And I'm saying that because I didn't do it, and it took me many years of paying for that to be able to get caught up in my financial plan. What do I mean by that? I see a lot of our students in rural Ohio paying $1,000 a month for rent, as an example. And, I think they're living up in some suites that are probably nicer than my house, and I think that setting expectations, getting creative with roommates, getting creative with location, maybe you got to drive 5 or 10 minutes a little bit further, but really looking at anything you can do, obviously the budget being the main component of that process. But for me, the primary goal while you're in pharmacy school is to stop the bleeding as much as possible on student loans.
Stop the bleeding.
Stop
Tourniquet.
the bleeding.
Tourniquet.
Or minimize the amount that you borrow because of how the interest is accruing on those loans. And I think back to your comment earlier about monopoly money, a lot of people don't realize when you're borrowing $3,000 to go on a spring break trip, or you're borrowing $15,000 in the fall of your P1 semester, and much of that is for cost of living, that's accruing at 6, 7, 8% interest. And obviously that's going to capitalize upon graduation, and that's going to grow. And that's when you hear new practitioners coming out saying, wow, I've got $150,000, $200,000, $250,000, $300,000 of student loan debt, and I'm making payments, and I feel like I can't get ahead of these student loans. And that goes all the way back to the decisions that we make all the way through pharmacy school. And the mistake I made, Tony, was I didn't have any education around my student loans. I didn't know what they were. I didn't know the interest rates. I didn't know subsidized, unsubsidized. I didn't know any of that. And when you don't know any of that, the monopoly money situation becomes worse, because out of sight, out of mind. And so we are always starting at YFP with education, because what we find is once you educate yourself about your student loans, you get a little bit fired up, and you tend to want to start to put a plan together to either minimize the amount that you're borrowing, or for those that have already graduated, start to put a plan in place to attack them.
Well, I want to defend the student sort of. On one of the YFP episodes, I can't remember who it was that said it, but she said, there's a checkbox for take all the money, or there's a line for take this amount of money. Yeah. But how do you know what the line should be? You know, it's not like a thing where you're like, do you want to tip 10%, 15%, 20%? You know, do you want to take 90% of your loans, 80%, 75%? How do you, is there a rule of thumb we can use? Is there a way to, because I feel like anyone would just check the box to have money just in case, but that just in case turns into, I can't believe I spent it.
Well, and to your point right there, I mean, and that was a great interview that we had with Brianne Porter, is that the easier option to do is to check the box and say, give me all the money, right? I mean, that's just the easier thing to do. The harder thing to do, which is what we recommend you do, is sit down and figure out, okay, what are roughly my monthly expenses? What can I do to minimize those expenses? And what is it going to cost for the semester for me to live? So rent, food, transportation, a little bit of fun here or there. Obviously, you know what your tuition is going to be. You know what your fees are going to be. If you can then put together at least a portion of, or a rough monthly budget, we can then know to say, okay, this is the dollar amount that I'm going to need in student loan money, or maybe you're working with family, whatever the situation would be. But just saying, yes, I'll take the full amount, $30,000 or $40,000, without necessarily figuring out exactly what you need, I think that's a recipe for spending money that you don't necessarily need to be spending, and then obviously paying the interest on that over time. And that's exactly what many people do. And we've had several on the podcast that we've interviewed, and myself included, had made that mistake, that the monthly budget component and really figuring out exactly what your monthly expenses are going to help exactly borrow the amount that you need, not over borrow, and minimize the amount of interest that you're going to take. So we've got lots of resources on the YFP page. We got a budget template that people can get started. We've done some podcast episodes and blogs about that if people are looking to get started with the budgeting process.
So I remember a couple, I think they were living in Arizona, in Tempe actually, and they, I guess what my question is we'll stick with the would you rather. Would you rather stay in and eat, or would you rather go out and eat? And as part of a bigger picture where if you just have all that money in the bank, there's no need to become innovative and creative. But when you don't have money and you have a scarcity, as many entrepreneurs do when they start their business, all of a sudden there's a lot of innovation that goes on. Can you talk a little bit about the innovative ways some of your guests have maybe actually, and what I keep hearing over and over again is that they were more satisfied with less money and less satisfied with more money, which made no sense to me at first. But then as I started to hear their stories, it actually kind of made a little bit of sense that, yeah, we got creative and we spent time talking to each other instead of, just grabbing a bite or whatever it was. Can you talk a little bit about, that innovation that comes from scarcity?
Yeah, and I think Jill, you mentioned from Tempe, her and her husband really highlighted that well. And my wife and I felt the same way. Tim Church, YFP team member, and his wife Andrea have talked about it, and other guests we've had on the show as well. If you've ever have been through that process where you're broke and you're grinding it out, you're trying to accomplish different goals, I think there is satisfaction in less for many different reasons. One, I think it makes you enjoy those treats more than you would otherwise. So, if my wife and I are really trying to save and achieve whatever financial goals we're working on, and we only have $50 or $100 dedicated to eating out in a certain week or a month or whatever, when we go on that trip or on that date, that obviously means much more to us than if we were not budgeting, not working through that together. And I think it's multifactorial. Not only is it a scarce resource, so you enjoy it more, but it's also in the terms of my wife and I working together, or in Jill's case or in Tim's case, when you're accomplishing that with somebody else together, there's that satisfaction of achieving a goal with somebody else. And so I think that's just human nature, that when there is a scarce resource, you tend to appreciate the things that you have more. And that's one of the greatest benefits I see from the students, the residents, and the new practitioners that we've worked with, is that while in the moment they may say, Tim, this really sucks, this phase of paying off these student loans and
there's
living,
nothing pleasant about it.
Yeah, not eating out. And obviously there's balance in all of this. But the real reward comes in the future, when even when it's all done, what you hear from people that we interview on the podcast is, it's not like when it's all done, they all of a sudden open up the floodgates and do whatever they want, because they've learned the behavior, they've learned the idea of delayed gratification.
Who was the husband and wife that kept working? Or you asked them directly, like, so you stopped working, right? They're like, no, we
Adam
still work the
Patterson.
crazy. Yeah, we still work the crazy hours.
Yeah, that's a couple. They paid off, I think it was $230,000 of debt in 26 months, and something crazy. But they couldn't stop hustling after that, because, and we're going to do more of this in the blog and the podcast. This life after debt free, right? Becoming debt free is not the holy grail. There's this whole other life, and enjoying some of it, and achieving retirement goals and business goals and all these other things. But once you have disciplined yourself, and once you have those behaviors in place, yes, you may not live exactly that same way, but that mindset of wisdom and frugality is going to follow you well beyond paying off your student loans. And so I think the real benefits of going through that phase of budgeting and goal setting and working with somebody else and achieving whatever goal you're trying to achieve really comes well into the future beyond that. And for me, whether it's personal or in the business or whatever, those principles tend to follow me, even though we paid off our loans going on 3 years now ago.
Okay, well, let's change track a little bit. Since I have a residency trained pharmacist on the line, I'm not going, but ASHP is in early December, so just kind of around the corner, maybe a month and a half away. So the first question I would have is, as we get this kind of push from the professors that students should do residency. Let's first ask the question, should someone do a residency or should someone not do a residency? The money is pretty straightforward. It's 45 to 50 if you do, more than that if you don't.
Yeah.
More than that, yeah. So
I know a lot of residencies in Ohio are still in the high 30s, low 40s. Yeah.
Yeah. So we'll start with that. Should you do a residency?
So I'm going to not answer your question intentionally. And here's why. Because when I did a lot of career education in my former job at Neomed, and students would often come to me and say, Dr. Ulbrich, do you think I should do a residency or should I not? And as you know, and you alluded to this in terms of the faculty perception and maybe the influence, when I would ask a student, hey, what are you thinking about doing after graduation? Those that said, I'm thinking about going to do residency or a fellowship or PhD, whatever, they would have their shoulders would be nice and high. They would be great posture, excited about what they're doing. And those that would say, oh, I'm just going to go take a retail job. They would look at you with that look of disappointment. And to me, the conversation does not start with, should I do a residency or not? The conversation should start with, what are the things that interest you? What are the career goals that you have? What are you passionate about? Why did you get into pharmacy to begin with? And if we can articulate those things, we can then work backwards to say, does getting to that path, is a residency going to help you on that path or not? And for many things it will, for many things it will not, right? And so if somebody has entrepreneurial pursuits around whatever, wellness services, things like you're doing, or real estate or personal finance or owning their own pharmacy, a residency may or may not be a fit for that. Whereas if somebody says, I really want to be an inpatient trained hem-onc pharmacist or an ID specialist, well, that path may be a little bit clearer. And so I think we have to stop the question of, should I do a residency, yes or no? And we first have to start with, what are we trying to achieve with that residency? And is that residency actually going to help me get down that path or not? If it is, then obviously that's a step in an investment that you should consider, but may not be an absolute. And I think the conversation, Tony, we need to start having is there a financial point in time where residency maybe should be off the table? Right? Because back to our comment about monopoly money, how do we balance this conversation of career goals? But I want to do residency, but I have $350,000 in debt and I'm going to defer my loans for 2 more years. Is there a point where that's no longer okay, or you delay residency? And I think that's a conversation that many aren't willing to have because we're solely focused on the credential and the residency and not necessarily including it in with the conversation of personal finance or life experiences.
This is why Ohio State got you, because you answered the question so well, which is, I think we're asking the wrong question, which is a very hard thing to see, but it seems like from your experience, you found that that's just the wrong question. Let's see if that's the tool that you're going to use to get to wherever you want to go, but not necessarily it. Well, as people are working through school, can you tell me a little bit about what you think in terms of part-time job versus excelling in school? So I know that they're not necessarily, you could maybe have some balance, but let's say you go full into working so you have no debt, or you just enjoy the pharmacy experience, take out all the loans you can, and then you worry about the money later. So tell me a little bit about working and being in pharmacy school, and how much to work or something like that.
Yeah, this is a great question. And I'm going to bring a few different perspectives here. I didn't work through pharmacy school, and I think that was a mistake. I worked in the summer, but not during school. And I can tell you from my experience working with students over the last 10 years, those that are not working while they're in school are at a significant disadvantage when it comes to getting a job or getting a postgraduate training, whether that's residency, fellowship, PhD, master's, whatever. Now, of course, first and foremost, you have to graduate, you have to pass your courses, you have to get your PharmD, right? And I think that's worth saying because I've worked with many students that are trying to hustle 30 or 40 hours a week and they're failing their classes. Well, that pay at $12 to $20 an hour isn't going to matter a whole lot if you're never going to reach that full pay of a pharmacist salary. So first and foremost, we've got to pass our courses. However, I think for the vast majority of students, and there's going to be exceptions to this on either side, the vast majority of students should be, in my opinion, working all throughout pharmacy school. And I know different schools have different stances on that. I personally cringe when I hear College of Pharmacy academics and administrators saying you should not work while you're in school. I mean, there is no better hands-on experience and application than getting into the workforce and seeing live what you're learning in class. But also for me, Tony, it's more about the non-tangible skills around working with other people and conflict resolution and stress management and time management and work-life balance and all of those skills that are going to make somebody a better employee, a better resident, whatever, after graduation. We actually had this conversation at length at Neomed about what's best for our students because we felt like we had to give them guidance or recommendation. And what we ultimately came up with as a faculty is to say, of course, not all students are created equal, but we feel like as students who are maintaining a consistent academic record, we would recommend roughly about 8 hours per week of work. Now, I've worked with students who are working 25 hours a week and they're fine. And I've worked with students who are not working at all and they're flunking out of pharmacy school. So, of course, there's a wide variety. But as a rough barometer, I think some work. And I think for me, it should be longitudinal. It shouldn't just be in the summer. It should be throughout the work year. Now, the thing I would have done different, Tony, in addition to working during the year, because I didn't do that, I just worked during the summer, is I would have probably gotten a little bit of non-pharmacy work experience. And as I now look at some of the entrepreneurial ventures I'm involved with, it would have been fun to get some outside business experiences, even if that was apprentice type of work, of seeing a different side of things beyond pharmacy. And of course, that would have to come into making sure they can balance those hours along with their academic work. But I would encourage your listeners to think about, is there maybe some pharmacy work they could do, but are there other interests they have in business, real estate, working with you as an intern? I've seen some of these pharmacy entrepreneurs have internships that they offer. Are there different skill sets that you could get that would help broaden the skill set that you have, but also make you more marketable as a graduate going into the future?
Okay, well, let's actually talk about the residency showcase floor, because I think that it's so improper to ask certain questions, but that's exactly when you want to ask the certain questions, especially if they're not on the website. So how would you, well, first I'll put the blanket statement, what questions would you ask financially, but how would you approach, a current resident and say, hey, how are you getting by in San Francisco on that stipend? You know,
Yeah, and I think that's a tricky question to ask because in my experience, you're probably asking a lot of residents that may not have a plan for how they're getting by. So be
oh,
careful where you're getting advice from. But
plan.
yeah, I think you can certainly do your work ahead of time. It's published on the ASHP directory what the salary is. You obviously know the location. You can do some research on cost of living. But I think asking the questions around culture of the residency program, the amount of hours that they're working, and what are some of the social activities that are involved, and where do most of the residents live to get an idea of, what's your commute going to look like? What are the neighborhoods people are living in? And then you could do some research on rent and other things. Those will help you get closer to potentially projecting a budget and trying to get a feel for, okay, yes, my ideal residency is in Manhattan in New York City, but I've got $300,000 student loan debt. So maybe I need to be looking at a couple programs in the Midwest or some other areas that I can help balance this desire to do residency, but also not sending my financial plan off track further than it already is. So again, I think this goes back to an earlier question you asked about ideal choice versus maybe a secondary or a tertiary choice. And I think it's easy for all of us, no matter what it is in life, all of us to build up the number one in our head, whether it's where you choose to live or the job that you take or the university that you attend. It's easy to build up in our mind that there's such a big difference between the number one and the number two and number three and number four. And I think my advice to your listeners would be to really challenge that thought process to say, how much are you hanging on to the idea of the number one city, residency, job, whatever? And is it worth that idea and what you're holding it to be versus the financial implications it may have in your life?
Okay. Well, I've asked you a ton of questions. Is there any kind of blanket advice you would want to give as many students are spending what is a ton of money to them to get to Anaheim, and then they're going to, pay for the hotel and everything. And then obviously there's financial challenges that come along with, hey, I got 11 interviews and they're across the country.
Yeah.
So what blanket advice maybe do you have to keeping the residency application search process, that whole thing kind of not necessarily manageable, but maybe some best practices or ways that you can kind of not make it go so crazy that you're like, all right, I'm going to be given blood every other week or plasma every other week to afford plane tickets to residency interviews.
Yeah, and I think there's, some obvious ones. So obviously, when you think about mid-year is bunking up with other people and getting creative with travel plans and, looking at when you can fly out and seeing how costs change. When it comes to residency interviews, really working with mentors and peers to figure out what's the right number. And Tony, the thing I often saw of our highest performing students is that fear of failure gets them at the last minute. And that top group that I know they're probably going to get 80 to 90 or 100% of the interviews, they freak out in the last month or two and they apply to 15 places and then they have 12 interviews, right?
Okay. Yeah.
And so really getting an honest look at your application from whether it's faculty mentors, whether it's residency program directors, residents to say, how competitive are you as a candidate? And can somebody help you really identify, how many interviews might you get and what does this mean in terms of travel costs and other things? And then when it comes to actually interviews, there are some programs I know that will be flexible and help try to coordinate travel plans so you can sync up different interviews so you're not flying all over the country. And obviously, when you're going on those interviews, trying to stay with family or friends or other ones. But my main point here, Tony, would be is that what I've often seen our P4 students do is they tend to throw up their hands in the P4 year and just kind of financially give up because tuition costs are higher that year, appy rotations are expensive, residency travel costs. Then they start thinking about the NAPLEX and the MPJE and background checks, and they're just like, I give up, right?
And by the way, they're homeless, right?
And they're homeless.
And they're homeless. Like you can't get mail anywhere,
They're like, I'll get the grace period eventually. I'll worry about it 6 months after I graduate. And I think more than ever, rather than throw your hands up, it's time to dig in and think about exactly what all those costs are. Do everything you can to minimize those and create that budget in that P4 year. Because obviously, any of those costs that are increased and borrowing that increases is going to come back to haunt you in terms of borrowing. But I look forward to seeing you and a lot of your listeners out at Anaheim this year. So excited to get out there.
Okay. Well, I've asked you a bunch of questions. I guess what would be the first step that you would recommend as our last question here? What's the first step if somebody finally says, all right, look, this money thing, it's bothering me now. I'm not sleeping. I understand that it's not due until I graduate or until after residency. What is the very first step? Is it to read through the book? Is it to look at your website? Is it a particular podcast? What one single step do you think has been most impactful for somebody who's just kind of said, it's time?
Yeah, this is a great question. And I think and shout out here to Tim Church, who's done an awesome job of building out a ton of free resources on our page. I would just encourage your listeners, go to yourfinancialpharmacist.com. And from there, you'll get access to whatever is most meaningful to you at this point in time. So if it's a free guide on student loans, if it's something related to home buying, if somebody's wondering about refinancing, if it's getting access to the book, if it's about insurance, we have calculators on that site. Head on over to yourfinancialpharmacist.com, and we have different sections where where are you at today? How can we help you? And from there, they can self-navigate and get the resources that they need. And of course, they can reach out to us anytime, info@yourfinancialpharmacist.com. If they can't find anything, we'd be happy to help.
Sounds good. Well, thanks so much for being on the Pharmacy Leaders Podcast.
Thanks, Tony. Appreciate it.
Support for this episode comes from the audiobook Memorizing Pharmacology, a relaxed approach. With over 9,000 sales in the United States, United Kingdom, and Australia, it's the go-to resource to ease the pharmacology challenge. Available on Audible, iTunes, and Amazon.com, in print, ebook, and audiobook. Thank you for listening to the Pharmacy Leaders Podcast with your host, Tony Guerra. Be sure to share the show with the hashtag #PharmacyLeaders.